Welcome to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, a podcast about the United States and the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm your host, Michael Patrick Cullinane. Welcome back to the show. Today we're going to be talking about China. In fact, we'll be talking about the myth of China and the myth of the China market, which pervaded the thinking among foreign business people at the time. With a booming population of 500 million people in the early 20th century and an underdeveloped infrastructure, industrialists of the Western world and of Japan saw huge potential building railroads in China. The Qing dynasty encouraged foreign investment despite a reputation for being anti-merchant, and the Chinese government also encouraged migration through the massive continental land empire. During the 19th century, port cities grew in size and trade with foreign merchants grew as well. And as the power of foreign traders expanded, especially that of the British, which did a brisk trade in China, so did the king's power over port cities decline. The Opium Wars of the 19th century are probably the best example of this. Despite bans on opium in China, the British and the French persisted in selling the drug, fighting 2 wars in China to maintain the trade. The Qing dynasty lost control over the ports, and as a result of these wars, other foreign nations flocked to the coastal cities to take similar advantage of the market and the weak Chinese government. Japan, Germany, Italy, and others carved out spheres of influence in Chinese ports. As trade increased, opportunities inland also materialized. Commercial loans for infrastructure projects saw banks like HSBC, the Hong Kong and Singapore Banking Company, come into China to finance these projects. German, Italian, French, and Japanese banks followed the British example. The United States was a little late to the investment rush. After acquiring the Philippines, however, it pushed for an inter-imperial or self-regulation of the China market, giving all world powers access to the ports and commercial opportunities. Today, we know it better as the open door policy, in which the European and Japanese and Americans agreed to a cooperative approach in China. That same approach developed in the banking sector, well, at least for a while. Joining me today is Ghassan Moazzin, an assistant professor at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. He's a historian of 19th and 20th century China with a particular interest in the development of the modern Chinese economy. Today, we're talking with Ghassan about his book, Foreign Banks and Global Finance in Modern China, Banking on the Chinese Frontier from 1870 to 1919. Welcome to the show, Ghassan.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here because I think the topic is one that will be of interest to many of the listeners. The Gilded Age and Progressive Era is, of course, known for industrialization, but it's the financing that really drives that as well. And your book gets to the heart of this, but naturally it gets to the heart of it in China rather than any other part of the world, which is an important market. Can you just set the scene for us? Why is foreign investment in China so important in this period? And how does foreign banking in China disrupt the traditions there of their commercial traditions?
Sure. So I think in order to understand this, we have to kind of go back to the Opium Wars. China is basically being opened up to foreign trade. You have treaty ports in places like Shanghai, which are basically under foreign control. First, foreign merchants kind of settle there in order to do trade with China. But what happens then rather quickly, what happens then rather quickly is basically that you need someone to finance this trade. In the beginning, these trading houses can still do that themselves, but there's kind of increasing need for sort of special banks that take care of that. And so you have the first foreign banks, primarily British banks, coming into between 1840s and 1890s. And then in between the 1890s and the First World War, which is what my book mainly focuses on, you have also a lot of non-British, including American banks coming in. In terms of investment, what basically happens is that China is trying to modernize, and that means that in particular things like railway construction are things that are on the agenda for Chinese modernizers. But of course, that needs a lot of money, and money is rather expensive in China at the time. And at the same time, you have people, particularly in Europe, where kind of return rates on investments are relatively low at that time. Between 1870s and 1890s, particularly, they look abroad for new ways to invest. And China in a sense, like you can compare it with what happened with China after the 1970s, and it's kind of seen as this up and coming market, and people want to invest there. And so this is kind of the other reason why these foreign banks come in, because they're kind of the intermediary between the two. In terms of, because you mentioned that whether how was the interaction with Chinese commerce. So I think what we need to keep in mind is that China was a highly commercialized sort of society. There were very lively markets. You have all sorts of different economic institutions. I think where foreign banks come in, so I don't see it that much as them being disruptive. I just see it's more like what historians sometimes call institutional voids. So you basically have this, China wanting to engage with the global economy, but China does not have modern financial institutions that kind of have a global branch network and that connect globally. And that's where the foreign banks basically come in. So they basically fill this kind of void that is left open by the absence of Chinese institutions that can do that.
And just if you could just say a little bit more about, you started off with the Opium Wars, and you mentioned British banking as being one of the first. Is it because of the Opium Wars, and is the rise of other foreign banks? I know you particularly look at German banks, but is the rise of the other banking branches, other nations coming in, a result of the growing commerce that they're doing? Is it part and parcel of that?
I think there are several reasons. Well, if we think about why first British banks, I think there are sort of two reasons for that. First of all, certainly in the sort of first decades after the Opium War, Britain is the main trading partner of China, and so that means that kind of explains why you would have British banks particularly interested. At the same time, in general, the 19th century kind of sees the growth of multinational banking, and Britain there again as a leader. And what happens actually quite a bit in China in the early period is that you have British banks that are primarily first based in India that then kind of expand themselves to China, but they in a sense already have kind of an infrastructure in place, and they just have to put up another branch in a place like Hong Kong, for example. So I think that explains why Britain comes first. And I think why in the 1890s you have other non-British banks come in. I think it has to do with the expansion of Western Empire. It has to do with other kind of, Germany obviously kind of new nation state wanting to come in and growing in the China trade, just as other places like Japan, the United States, I would also see in that as well. And again, that then, you want to have investment and trade with China, and then you want to have a vehicle for that can finance all of that or be the intermediary. And I think that's when foreign banks then come in.
So that makes perfect logical sense. And I suspect that's probably why the historiography has developed the way it has. One of the things that your book accomplishes is to change our view of the imperial framework, or at least, not diminishing the imperial framework, but just saying that there are other reasons why these banks are coming in. And having read the book, I understand this, but could you tell listeners how your book challenges the prevailing view that foreign banks were merely agents of empire, and that there's other agents here as well?
Yeah, sure. So I think, what I tried to do in the book is basically get us out of this rather traditional view of the foreign banks came in and they kind of exploited the Chinese economy and so on, and plundered everything and controlled everything. And I should say that there is other scholarship that more recently has sort of started to challenge that as well. And so I'm kind of building on that. But what I basically try to do in the book is kind of complicate things and show that power relations are not quite as straightforward as a lot of the previous literature has kind of suggested. And you have these foreign banks that are always pretty much dependent on cooperating with Chinese officials, Chinese bankers, because they can't just reach into the Chinese economy at will, or they can't just make deals with the Chinese government and just impose their will. They always have to work together. They have to kind of find people on the Chinese side of things that have common interests and with whom they can kind of work together. And that also means that in many cases the foreign banks are not the actors with most leverage or most that are the most powerful in a particular relationship, but rather it's really a give and take, and there's a lot of interdependence going on. And I think that's sort of what I kind of tried to show in the book.
It reminds me a little bit of Gare Lundestad's thesis in where he talks about empire by invitation during the Cold War and the European and American context, largely about the Marshall Plan and the development of an interdependent transatlantic trade. Do you think that where you're getting to now in your scholarship is because of maturity on this topic, that we started out with a sort of sense that this was imperial, but now we're moving away from it being exclusively that and giving the Chinese agency in the commercial functions of the state at the time are just a maturing of the historiography?
I mean, I would hope so. That's certainly the kind of direction that I would. That I felt, when I was doing the research, that I hope the scholarship would move into in that particular direction, because I think sort of taking a more detailed and a more on the ground and a more sort of approach that kind of really looks at how things work on the ground, that on the local level, that seemed to be to me the most fruitful way of approaching the topic. I should say that. In a sense, the way I'm coming at the topic might also be a bit different from at least a lot of other historians that have worked on this in the West, because I was trained as a China historian. I'm not really a historian of empire or anything like that. I was kind of, trained as someone who has to go to the Chinese sources, has to kind of understand the Chinese actors. That's kind of the first task that I was sort of that was what I focused on, and so that. I guess also led me to kind of, trying to understand even more, like, what did the Chinese actors do, and what is Chinese agency here? What do the Chinese sources tell us? Because I think that's also key. If you kind of want to get away from this kind of imperial framework a bit, then Chinese sources are quite helpful, because I think they kind of reveal quite clearly how things work on the Chinese side, and you really need that in order to kind of undig the Chinese agency in the whole story, I think.
So do you think that the reason why other historians may have missed this angle is because there's that lack of engagement with Chinese sources, especially in, say, American readings of open door policies or of European views of international banking and colonization?
So I think there's sort of a twofold problem here. I think on the one hand side, you have, of course, Chinese historians, not that many, but some that have looked at this. And they, of course, can read the Chinese sources, but they've got the problem that they don't have they normally don't have access to foreign archival sources, which you, of course, also need in order to research foreign banks. But certainly traditional scholarship was very much still in this kind of very much influenced by Marxism and kind of looking at how this all fits into a kind of a Marxist framework, and therefore foreign banks and foreign finance are kind of traditionally seen as very much part of empire. But yeah, on the side of kind of people in the West working on this, yes, I think, a lot of the histories that have been written were like kind of just institutional histories, even commissioned histories of foreign banks, which means that, then you have kind of a very much a focus on the bank itself and trying to describe every detail of the particular bank's history, but without really making reference to Chinese actors. So I think on the Western side, that really has been a problem, rather, that this kind of lack of, I feel kind of the engagement in many cases with the Chinese side of things is only superficial. Yet, of course, you have to talk about China because a particular bank operates there. But I think it kind of often doesn't really go beyond that, and the focus is very much on, okay, these are the archives of the bank that I have, maybe diplomatic archives as well, and that's what I'm using. And that, of course, kind of limits very much the kind of perspective that you have on, I would again say, particularly on Chinese actors, because for that you need the Chinese sources to really understand what's going on.
Absolutely. I mean, that makes perfect logic. All right, well, let's delve into the book's real, the depths of the book are really about the banks in China. And so tell us about the banks. And your book obviously looks most closely at German banks. I say obviously. When I first picked up the book, I thought, I'm going to read about American banks in here. I should have read the introduction first. But what you look most closely at is the German Asiatic Bank. And so can you tell us about German bankers and some of the other major players, maybe delving into the British or the Americans?
Sure. So as I said, sort of the kind of the first banks that kind of get established in China were mainly British banks, and some of these names will still be familiar, probably HSBC, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, is kind of a major player and remains the leading multinational bank in China that kind of comes about in the 1860s. We think of the HSBC certainly later towards the 1890s, early 1900s as a British bank, but it's really an international bank. So you have all kinds of different, you have Germans even involved in the founding of the bank. It's mainly kind of a bunch of merchants that feel, well, we need a bank that kind of finances or provides financial facilities for our trade. And so that's how the HSBC comes about. And there are certain other British banks, as I said, quite a few actually that kind of have a base in India first and then come into China. But yeah, I think HSBC, Standard Chartered are a few of the British banks that are quite prominent. And as I said, then sort of in the 1890s, you have more non-British banks that come in. The particular German bank that I focus on is the Deutsche Asiatische Bank, which translates into German Asiatic Bank, which kind of is established in 1889, opens its doors in Shanghai in 1890. It's kind of established by really a broad swath of leading German banks that are interested in China. As I said, reasons, and then in the case of the German bankers, the reasons were really mainly investment. So they really saw this, dream. China is the last huge country without railways. Germany is industrializing. German bankers have a lot of ties with German industry. So the idea was, okay, we're going to finance railway construction, and we're going to have it built with German materials, German engineers, and so on and so forth. And so this German bank is established, also supported by the German government. So the German government also was quite keen in having a German bank on the ground because they also saw China as this big export market. And what they were unhappy with was that, German merchants had been doing trade in China even before there was, the establishment of the German Empire. And they were very happy to do their trade to be financed by British banks. But the German government didn't really like that. They wanted to have sort of an autarkic block of German commerce that could just make sure that there was not that much dependence on British finance. So the German government supported this establishment as well. And so this is how the kind of DAB came, or the Deutsche Asiatische Bank DAB came about. And what you then have in the sort of 2.5 decades before World War I is really a rapid influx of foreign banks coming into China. That includes Japanese banks. The Yokohama Specie Bank is probably most important, which is sort of very much a creation of the Japanese government. But yeah, you also have American bankers, and I'm happy to talk a bit more about that. Come in, and it's kind of like all sorts of leading countries want to have their own bank, home bank in China at the time. And these banks kind of, well, they are competitors, of course, but there's also a lot of cooperation. So they will certainly cooperate in the banking sector. Of course, you have to have that, as you have today, but they also cooperate in terms of raising money for China on foreign capital markets quite a lot. And so while I do focus on the German bank as a case study, I think in terms of narrative, that always helps with a book. But
before we get to the Americans, can I ask you something about how you're framing it as well? Because I think this is really interesting, and this gets to the crux of your argument. You call them international banks, but clearly they've got this connection to a home state, and they're backed presumably by capital primarily from their home state. So how do you make that distinction from them being a state operation with German or American or British capital? How do you distinguish that from being an international bank that is operating in a different fashion?
Well, I don't really. In terms of the kind of the terminology I'd like to use, I think multinational banks is probably most useful, because I think that just means you have a bank that kind of has assets, or that kind of operates across different countries. In terms of state banks, I really try to get away from that, because I think that is sort of a simplistic view that still is quite common in some of the older scholarships, certainly, in the sense of like, okay, this is a German bank, so they just do what the German government says, for example. In the particular case study that I look at, this becomes rather clear, because it's you have these German bankers who are very cosmopolitan, international. They're happy to work together with the British or French or whoever really. They have connections throughout the world really with other bankers, and then you have and they are mostly after profit, of course. So they're not interested in like kind of doing political investments and just investing in a particular project because this is good for the German president in China or something like that. And that is, of course, what the German diplomats want. So if you read the German diplomatic archives, as time goes on, there's just criticism over criticism and conflicts going on with the German bankers because they just don't feel that this German bank does really what they had hoped it would do, and that means support German commerce. Rather, they just do what is good for their own balance sheet, and that's kind of their primary objective. I think in the end, if we look at foreign banks at that time, there's kind of a broad spectrum. You do have certain banks, for example, the Japanese Yokohama Specie Bank, I think is a good example here, which are very much, government, at least in part government funded and government controlled, and they have kind of a very clear policy objective, whereas other banks are kind of in the middle. So with the German bank I look at, of course, there was, particularly in the beginning, government support, but I think that kind of becomes more complicated as time goes on. And then you have banks like HSBC, which is, as I said, in the 1860s, 1870s, it has from the start, particularly when it comes to kind of where to raise money abroad, has a particularly strong British connection, but it kind of moves into becoming a British bank in the 1890s because you kind of do need, for certain things in China, particularly when it comes to the big loans, you kind of need a diplomatic connection. A foreign banker can't just go to the imperial court and get an audience with the Chinese foreign ministry. You kind of need to have a diplomat that goes with you, and so you have also some banks that kind of grow into a bank that kind of needs kind of a national home in some way. But I think again, my what I try to do is to complicate things a bit and show that there's a spectrum, and we have to really kind of take these institutions as institutions in their own right and look what they actually do in negotiations or in their operations in China, rather than assuming that the home government is kind of behind everything.
I think you do complicate things quite a bit, and I think in a positive way, and especially I really like the way you refer to the banks as frontier banks, because that to me really is what you're getting at here. So can you explain the term that you use and why you think it's the most appropriate one?
Sure. I mean, this kind of comes out of it comes from two angles. I mean, first of all, there are historians. Well, I mean, I think in general, sort of not just historians of China, but work on frontiers and kind of frontier spaces has been quite a growth in the past few decades. Historians of China have also looked at that, so I kind of built on that scholarship. But I've also got this idea from basically some of the older scholarship on banking on the American frontier, actually, which is. In terms of conceptually why I came up with this particular term is thinking about the frontier, a place where you have kind of different flows of capital, commodities coming together, different empires overlapping, including the Chinese Empire, and you have kind of these frontier spaces where things are rather ambiguous and hybrid in a way. You don't have you have kind of these actors like foreign banks that kind of occupies a lot of in-between spaces between different empires and different actors, and kind of there are kind of a lot of opportunities that open up, but particularly for the foreign banks, what I liked about this idea of operating in the frontier is also that it's in a sense limiting. So the foreign banks, for example, do not go into the Chinese hinterland. They sit in these treaty ports, and they have to kind of, in order to reach into the banking sector, into the Chinese economy, they have to kind of cooperate with Chinese actors. And I guess the concept of frontier bank also helps me understand, or helps me kind of think through the kind of hybrid nature of these kind of foreign banks themselves. Like, these are foreign banks, but they operate in China. They are, of course, mainly staffed by foreigners. So a bank like the German Asiatic Bank, they would be mostly German bankers, but they also have a Chinese department in their bank, and they have Chinese staff, and they need this Chinese staff in order to actually be able to operate and engage with Chinese customers, which is really important for their business. They would have dealings with all sorts of different diplomats. They would have dealings with diplomats of their home government, but also with Chinese diplomats and important contacts, and they really depend on these sort of transnational networks that span all sorts of different actors, not just in China, but actually reaching back into Europe. And so I think kind of this ambiguity of kind of operating in this space where you have all these overlapping flows of commodities, capital, and empires, but also the hybrid nature of the particular banks that I look at, that kind of led me to think a bit more about them on the frontier and as frontier banks, because I think that really, at least I guess I was sort of trying to find a way of bringing together and expressing this kind of ambiguity, and then this terminology kind of helped with that.
I think it's useful, especially given all of the baggage that comes with the term frontier. And as you say, there's been a re-examination of frontiers and borders in recent years. Look, naturally, I want to ask about American banks. I have a big research interest in the open door and the way it reshapes China and the Far East more generally. They're late to the party, the Americans. They don't get a bank there until later. Then the Germans are already there. The British are already there. But what part do they play in the commercial life of China after they do arrive?
Basically, the main American bank that comes in is the International Banking Corporation, which is established in 1901 and opens in China in 1902. And it then later is taken over by Citibank, which we of course still know now. And sort of from, again, having not focused on this particular bank, what I can see is that it becomes a leading foreign bank at that time, and operates very much along the same lines as what I can see with other foreign banks. So in terms of trade finance, that's sort of, it's kind of a pretty common picture that we see there. What is sort of a bit more interesting, I think, is the involvement of American bankers in kind of investment in China, because I feel there's certainly this idea that they come in somewhat later. So if we look at kind of investment in China, and I'm talking about big loans that are floated for China in abroad, it's really Britain for the first few decades after the 1870s is clearly it's the international financial center anyways, but it is also the main place where China raises money. And then you have kind of France and Germany come in, and New York and the United States then come much later. It's really only towards the end of the Qing dynasty. So, Qing dynasty falls in 1911, that the US comes in. And then they do join the sort of the big consortium together with British, French, and German banks. And they do float loans for the Chinese government. But what is interesting then is that actually here I feel the kind of the political backlog seems to be rather important, because what basically happens is that you do have an American banking group that is involved in these sorts of loans, and then the Qing dynasty falls in 1911, and you have a new Republican government come in, and this government has the problem that it basically has no money. It is out of money. And so they look towards foreign banks again to basically raise a large loan for the Chinese government. But what happens then is that because of the political instability, these banks are not willing to float a loan without quite strict control clauses, meaning that they want to have revenues that are under foreign control designated as collateral for the loan. And then Woodrow Wilson is elected, and he kind of is the one that then, or this election then, or he is the one that kind of then leads to the American bankers actually retreating from this, because these particular loan conditions are supposedly too strict, and then that's kind of that's when they kind of leave this particular consortium. And of course, this all then again changes in World War I, because in World War I, all these kind of this cosmopolitan kind of interaction dissolves, and all these consortia, and then you actually see American banks coming in rather strongly again during the war, and offering money to the Chinese government.
It's fascinating to see how there's almost a pecking order as well amongst these groups. They're very cosmopolitan. They very much work together, but London is still the dominant power really throughout the period. What about the bankers themselves? I mean, you mentioned them quite a bit, and I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about them and about their Chinese counterparts. Who are the people that are actually making these deals happen?
Sure. So, in terms of I'm going to take my example of the German banker. So, in terms of the German bankers that are basically active in this whole kind of China, this kind of the whole area of China and so on. I think you have a lot of. First of all, on the ground. So, in a place like Shanghai, you would have a branch that would normally be led by a somewhat senior German banker. So ideally someone that would have had already some experience in China. That could even sometimes be someone actually without a banking background, but that has worked there as a merchant for a while and kind of knows what's going on the ground. But then you would actually have a lot of young bankers. So there are several kind of cases where I can see that you would have a German banker that would have kind of done an apprenticeship when they were like maybe 18 or something like that in Germany for a few years. Then they were often sent to London because again that was sort of the center of international finance, and it was kind of seen as a good training ground for sort of learning the ropes of doing international banking, and then they would be sent to China. And often, this was sort of for many of them a big adventure. Of course, you go out into this. It's even today, I would think, but certainly then you go out to China, completely unknown country, and everything is new and so on. They were often given quite early on quite a bit of responsibility, so they would be put in general, sort of you could climb, in a sense, the ladder of responsibility more quickly abroad, and that was a positive thing. So that's kind of what we have on the Chinese side, and there's this whole kind of treaty port life that is kind of very peculiar. Like a lot of these, for example, most of these foreign bankers would never learn Chinese, and they would very much stay in their enclaves. There are exceptions to that. So there are kind of China specialists that also develop in these foreign banks, but for the most part, they would kind of stay in these enclaves for most of the time. But the other side of the story is then kind of the senior bankers who sit in places like Berlin and London and so on, and those are really senior people that are not primarily occupied with China, but they would sit on the supervisory board of the bank, for example, and they would kind of have looked at the bank as kind of overall doing okay, but they're also the ones who have all these international connections. If you are a Berlin banker, they would have connections to Paris, New York, London, and they could then, particularly when it came to these big loan deals that were kind of done in terms of international cooperation quite a lot, then these networks really come into play a lot of these senior German bankers. Then talking about the Chinese counterparts. So, again, this is sort of something I try to really emphasize, is that if we look at the Chinese banking sector, for example, yes, you have these foreign banks and they can operate quite freely in the treaty ports, not under the control of the Chinese government. But if they want to do things like, and of course, as a bank, you do want to do that. You want to use your working capital, for example, and loan it out the Chinese banking sector. Because these foreign bankers didn't really have much of an understanding, they didn't know Chinese, and they didn't have much of an understanding of the Chinese banking sector. They had to rely on their Chinese staff and their Chinese kind of business partners for that. And what I kind of try to show is that these Chinese partners often were, in their own right, leading Chinese business people. They would have their own banks, their own businesses, and they would actually incorporate often these foreign banks as sources of cheap capital, in particular, into their larger business network. I think that kind of then turns the perspective. We don't just look at how do the foreign banks kind of control these Chinese banks and whatnot, but actually it's also the other way around in a way, and it also has to do with the fact that actually, in terms of risk, these foreign banks are kind of pulled into quite a lot of risky business practices of the Chinese bankers. And it's kind of, in a sense, this similar thing that happens on the kind of, if we look at the other side of the business of the foreign banks, the bigger loan business, which is that there again, you have relationships that build up with particular Chinese officials that are more open to using foreign capital. There were, of course, also people that opposed this vehemently, but there were certainly also Chinese officials that were rather open to that, financing railways, for example, with with foreign capital. And so for that, you have kind of these kind of partnerships also that come out, and you have networks that are really rely on having common interests in a particular project, let's say a railway or something like that. And so this kind of cooperation, I think, goes on really throughout if you look at the activities of foreign banks.
I mean, the people are really interesting. I'm wondering about what risks they take going to China, the foreign bankers. And then also maybe you could talk about that, but also talk about what risks the banks take as well, because China, for as lucrative as it might be, it seems like there's, well, you already mentioned the revolution in 1911, but there's other risks too. So maybe you could fill us in on those.
Yeah, sure. And I think, risk management, risk assessment is something that I think is actually a more useful lens in a sense to look at bankers, and because banking is always has to do with risk, and that's something there to kind of constantly worry about. In general, I should say that multinational banking was a rather risky business. It's a difference if you are kind of if you operate as a German bank in Germany, where you know the laws, you know the practices, you know how the banking sector works and so on. If you have to do that over long distances, and if you have to do that in a country that is rather foreign to you, there's a general operational risk of things can just go wrong, and there is quite a gap, certainly in the case of the German bankers. A huge distance to Berlin, of course, and having to kind of go back and forth, and there's always the question, how much leeway do the bankers in Berlin give the people in Shanghai and in the foreign treaty ports and so on. There was also the problem of exchange risk. So the problem is basically that Germany was on the gold standard. By that time, a lot of the kind of leading Western countries were on the gold standard, but China was kind of in terms of currencies, it was generally rather difficult. There were a lot of different local currencies, but generally silver was most important, at least for the business that these foreign bankers were doing. And so the exchange rate between silver and gold is always something that they have to worry about. But then in terms of these large-scale loans, you certainly have what we normally call sovereign risk. So if you are a country like China goes to London to borrow, investors normally wanted to know what is the risk of investing and basically lending money to China, and that would then determine the interest rates and so on. And in terms of assessing that actually becomes a really difficult proposition, because China doesn't, for the most, until the last years of the Qing, they don't have a budget or something like that. What we think about now, where you can kind of see, okay, what is the income of this, the country as a whole, particular state or something like that, a particular branch of the government that doesn't really exist. And so the bankers kind of have to, because China's customs revenues are kind of managed by an agency that is manned by foreigners mainly. So for a while that works out because they give very detailed reports on this income. But then once that is used up, it becomes much more difficult. And so this is sort of a whole separate issue of how do I actually create knowledge about Chinese finance in order to understand and assess risk. And then the final, I think, theme in terms of risk that comes up is political risk. What I'm kind of trying to show is that I think until 1911, things are rather stable. And it's kind of interesting, although there's quite a lot of criticism of the Qing dynasty, certainly not reforming enough and whatnot. The foreign bankers are really quite critical. But once it's gone and once it falls, they are quite uneasy about what is about to come, because basically 1911 revolution breaks out and the Qing falls, and you have a new regime that in many ways is still kind of has the same people in power, but there's a lot of instability, chaos going on, and so that raises political risk, and the foreign bankers then, for example, are more reluctant to lend. And the other big event is, of course, World War I, which kind of, particularly for the German banks, bankers changes a lot, because they are now certainly after 1917, after China enters the war, they are enemy subjects, and of course that's they're being liquidated then and so on. So that is then political risk at its extreme, kind of, and kind of spells at least temporary end of the bank's operations in China.
Yeah, and your book also talks about previous conflicts as well, whether it be the Boxer Rebellion or it was the war with Japan in 1895. So there's quite a bit of political risk built in. It's amazing in a sense that for so many years they're able to continue without budgets to get these foreign investors in. So that's a really incredible story. How does the international banking story over that century-long decline of China, how does banking explain the decline?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to sort of go too far and say that foreign banking kind of necessarily explains the decline in itself. Whether it's not just a story of decline in general, I would say, but I think what I can say is kind of this this idea of the idea of the institutional void. I really quite like that. That was quite helpful in writing the book, because I think we can kind of use foreign banks as a sort of benchmark and seeing, okay, China tries to industrialize and modernize, but some things are missing, certainly, from what would have made that possible. And one of those things, I think, is sort of a modern internationally operating banking system or banking institutions. And I think that's where foreign banks come in. They have to be the intermediaries. And what I kind of try to tease out a bit in the conclusion is that so foreign banks come in, and they, first of all, come in mainly in order to finance foreign trade. And that's clearly like an institutional void that is there. But they actually spread their business quite, they issue currency, they take on deposits, they do all kinds of other stuff. And I think the reason for that, again, is that there are no modern Chinese banking institutions in the late 19th century that are at least dominant. It's really only just starting out. And it's only really becoming prominent in the 1920s that can kind of fill this larger void, and therefore foreign banks become so prominent. And what I kind of try to show in the conclusion a bit is that once modern Chinese banks that are really kind of that are built after sort of Western models really come to prominence, then the kind of role of foreign banks also contracts quite a bit. So I think the golden era of foreign banking comes to an end after World War I, in big part because modern Chinese banks kind of come into the picture, and they also then are very efficient and offer modern banking services, and so that kind of undoes this kind of institutional void, this large institutional void, and shrinks it quite a bit. Where foreign banks operate.
That's interesting. In a way, you bypassed one of the questions that was in my mind, which is how does World War I transform the landscape of the banking sector in China? Because obviously you've mentioned that the German banks are going to be liquidated, but what does it mean for the balance of power of the other banks? I know your book makes the point of saying that they're cooperative and they're almost inter-imperial in a way, in that sense, but also you mentioned they're competitive as well. So what happens during World War I and immediately after World War I to the banking sector?
Sure. So I think World War I is so that's the final chapter in the book, and I think it was very interesting to look at that, particularly also sort of as we now think about globalization, deglobalization, and sort of how do these two processes kind of come together? I mean, what basically happens in World War I is that you have this very much, very cosmopolitan atmosphere in the treaty ports, a lot of cooperation. These people would socialize together as well. There would be friendships along, very much kind of across national lines. You have even individuals that are very much, I kind of highlight one of the German bankers who comes from an originally German family, but grows up in Scotland and is kind of, he's very welcome in both British and German clubs before the war. But then the war comes in, and the kind of cosmopolitan voices kind of are on the retreat very much. And people that had all along been kind of more nationalistically or nationalistic in their wishes and how things should work, that were more against. For example, German British cooperation in banking and so on, they come to the fore. They become really prominent. Of course, bolstered also by the general political background and that officially now German subjects were enemies, even though China remains neutral until 1917. But in any case, there couldn't be any more cooperation. And so I feel this, just as elsewhere in the world, where kind of what we want is this backlash against globalization. You have that in China as well, and so a lot of these kind of mechanisms that work quite well between the banks, and both cooperation on kind of the level of international finance, but also in the banking sector kind of dissolve. And and for the German bankers, it's really just about kind of trying to do what they can and to hedge the risk that is coming up, that if China declares a war. And so, this all comes apart. And again, I don't really look at the 1920s in my book, but certainly on the international level, and other historians have worked on this. There is kind of a trying to reconstitute that, but I don't think this cosmopolitan cooperation ever comes together quite as much as it was in the pre-World War One period. But in general, I think World War One in my story that I tell is kind of this, but it's kind of an end to this kind of cosmopolitan globalization story that is told in the other 5 chapters of the book. That kind of seems to all fall apart in World War One.
It's a great way to end things in a way, because there's this. It seems like there's a contemporary parallel, whether we're talking about globalization and the backlash against global commerce and trade and financing. This show very much wants to connect the past with the present. That's something, and I know that's a big debate in the world of history right now. But and you can tell me that there's no connections, but it seems like there could be some for today. So what's the importance for your book and the story of frontier banking in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era? What's the importance for today?
Sure. So I think, I don't want to sort of overdo the historical parallels, but I think what, to firstly comment on the kind of idea of globalization, deglobalization, I think what we can certainly see as a parallel is that for most of the story that the book tells is about globalization, and kind of commerce is at the forefront of things, and these kind of the bankers that I look at are pretty free in terms of kind of operating across borders and national boundaries, cooperating with other with bankers of other nationalities and so on. But what one does change that, and I feel what I certainly feel what is now that we are, I think, also in a period of deglobalization, what is kind of coming out quite strongly is, of course, that these kind of more nationalistic voices come to the fore, and you kind of see that the commercial in itself becomes much more political, and whether or not a deal can really be carried out, or certain flows of capital can happen or not, takes on a much more political angle, and some people are very happy with it. I mean, it's kind of interesting that. And I mentioned that in the book, is that these German diplomats are actually quite happy after 1914 in China, and because now, all the German merchants have to go to the German bank because they can't go to the British anymore, and so that's actually what they want. That's not necessarily what the German bankers want, but that's the kind of the German diplomats are quite happy about this. I think in general about in terms of the parallel between foreign banking now in China and foreign banking. In the period I look at, I think the main difference that we really see is that China, probably because foreign banks were so powerful in the period before 1914, they have been very cautious in letting foreign banks in again after 1978, and so there are very clear guardrails that kind of circumscribe what foreign banks can do. But also the other big difference is that the Chinese banks are major players, not just in China now, certainly in China, but also globally. And so, if we think about, all these Western banks, Japanese banks being very prominent in the 19th century, early 20th century, now we can probably see that Chinese banks also become kind of major players, particularly in the developing countries. And so this is another, I think, kind of quite a difference, I think I would say, to the period I look at.
I've got so many more questions about the contemporary Chinese context, not least the real estate market and the banking crisis that's sort of unfolding as we speak now. But certainly the Belt and Road Initiative and the funding that's going into other countries around the world is fascinating. This book is important, I think, for just that reason. And I think that, you've done a really great job of reframing this to put Chinese bankers into the picture, the Chinese marketplace, into the picture. And for that reason, I'm grateful. I don't think you get away from the imperial entirely, which is good because I don't think we can avoid that. But I just have to congratulate you, Ghassan, for a book that it's really thought provoking, and I'm sure is going to be on reading lists. Thanks a million.
Oh, thanks for having me. Really enjoyed this.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thanks for listening. You can follow the Gilded Age and Progressive Era on Twitter or on my website, michaelpatrickcullinane.com. Please consider subscribing or reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, because it really makes a big difference and helps direct others to the show. I hope you'll join me again for the next episode.